Okay, and now we will get started. So, hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. I am Laura Coffey, and I'm the president of the Society for Features Journalism. And I can tell you that everyone at SFJ is so excited and grateful to welcome Mallary Tenore Tarpley here for today's webinar about how to blend personal narrative and reporting in essays and books. Mallary, you will find today, is not only a hyper-talented writer and master of craft, she's also a wonderful, thoughtful human being, and you're going to love her. And so thank you so much for being here today, Mallary. Yeah, and to start us off, I thought I'd just share a little bit of background information about Mallary and then let her take it from there, and then we will leave time at the end for some questions. So save your questions, and you can also type some in the chat. We'll try to keep track of those too. So Mallary is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at Austin, where she teaches journalism and writing classes. And her debut book, which is called Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, is about to be released on August 5th, which is coming right up. And this book is equal parts memoir and journalism, and it explores the underdiscussed complexities of eating disorders and recovery from them. And in this book, Mallary weaves together her own personal story with her reporting, with perspectives from clinicians, researchers, and others with lived experience. And this process that she's gone through for creating this book is just fascinating and inspiring, and we all will learn so much from it. And that I will tell you personally that Mallary's reporting and writing process prompted me to pre-order a copy of Slip, and I know that I can't wait to receive it and read it. And I suspect that many of you are going to feel the same way after today's session. So in a little bit, we'll be sure to provide a link about the book in the chat. And also just a little more background, Mallary started her career at the Poynter Institute and is managing editor of Poynter.org. She wrote and edited stories about the media industry and more, and taught classes there as well. Her articles and personal essays also have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Dallas Morning News, the Tampa Bay Times, Teen Vogue, and Harvard University's Neiman Storyboard, among other publications. And she also writes an excellent weekly newsletter called Right at the Edge. And you can find that newsletter at Mallary, Mallary.substack.com. And this is one of those truly great, helpful newsletters with writing tips and best practices. I get very excited when I see it land in my inbox. And because of that newsletter, this is why I'm so excited about today's session, if you can't tell. So at this point, I'm going to let Mallary take it away. And again, we'll leave some time for questions at the end. All right. Thank you, Mallary.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Laura. And it's wonderful to be here with all of you today. I really appreciate you showing up, and I hope that you glean some helpful tips from this webinar. So I am going to mostly speak today just from my own experiences writing and reporting personal essays and my book Slip. So I will talk a lot about this idea of blending, right? How do we blend personal narrative and reportage in essays and books? So I want to start off with essays, and then we'll work our way toward books. I know many of you have written personal essays or want to. Some of you have written books, some of you may want to do that. So I hope that this is both informative, but also aspirational in terms of giving you ideas about what you can do and how you can take your work to the next level. So, with regard to essays, I did want to share this particular quote from Brene Brown, which says, "The only stories I share with the public are stories that I have really processed and stories where my healing is not contingent on your opinion of those stories." I think that's a really powerful quote because we all have personal stories that we want to share, but it may be that we're not quite ready to share them. I know there have been moments where I've written personal essays and I've thought, that didn't feel as authentic as I wanted it to because I was holding back on something. And that was typically an indicator that I wasn't yet ready to delve deeply into the hard truths of that narrative. And that's okay, right? Sometimes we need that time to be able to process what has happened and to really wrap our heads around what part of this story do we want to share and how do we do it in a way that feels really true to our experiences. So I have written a lot of personal essays over the years. I've been writing personal essays for probably over 15 years. And this is just a sampling of some of them. Most of them are related to motherhood, grief, loss, eating disorders, and recovery. And just to give you a little bit of background on my own story, I developed anorexia nervosa after my mother passed away from metastatic breast cancer when I was 11. So I developed anorexia at age 12. And much of my writing looks at that period and looks at my ongoing recovery from an eating disorder. So, when I think about personal essays, I like to think about how do I make these relevant to a larger audience? And this is something we're always thinking about as journalists, right? Our audience, who do we want to reach? And so I like to say that the best personal writing is not just about the I, but also about the collective we and the you, right? All of the people who we're hoping to reach and touch with our writing. And so I like to think of the words I, we, you when writing personal pieces because it makes me think of that phrase, I see, right? And I want my readers to know that I see them and I'm writing for them. So be keeping this expression in mind as you go about your own personal writing. Now, I've often said writing can be therapeutic, but it is not therapy, right? When I started writing my book, I actually made a very conscious decision to go back to therapy because I didn't want my writing to feel like a therapy session, right? I needed to be able to process some things off the page before I could actually write about them. And so, as we think about this, it's important to note that reporting and research can really make our personal essays seem like less of a journal entry and more of a story with insights and points of relatability woven in. And I will say that of all the different personal essays that I've written and pitched, whenever I tell an editor that I'm planning to do reporting for that personal essay, it really piques their interest more. I find that they're more likely to say yes to a piece, to a personal essay, if they know that I'm going to do some interviews as part of that. Now, many of you work in newsrooms, so you understand that. But I think that that's an important point too for freelancers who may not necessarily be working for an organization, but who are pitching pieces to various outlets. So just be thinking about that. This is a picture, speaking of journals, of all of my childhood journals. And there are a lot more journals not pictured here, but I took a little aerial view photo of journals that I kept when I was in treatment for anorexia. And those were incredibly helpful for me as I wrote my book and have been helpful resources as I've written personal essays as well. So I want to share this graphic with you because this has been really helpful for me as I think about just these two categories of reportage and personal essay. Now, reportage, when I say that, it's really reporting journalism, right? It's just sort of the fancy way of saying it. But very often in journalism, we tend to bifurcate these two things. We could swap out personal essay with feature writing, right? So if we were to say personal essay, feature writing versus reportage, a lot of times we think, okay, I'm either doing a news story or I'm doing a personal essay, or I'm writing a news story or I'm writing a feature story. But really, I think that the best writers and the best stories draw from elements of both of these columns. And that's important to keep in mind as we think about this blending of personal narrative and reporting. So, when we think about reportage or a news story, those are going to impart information, whereas a personal essay really renders more experience, right? We're helping readers to actually feel and see what has transpired. With reportage or a news story, you're pointing people to information that they need to understand the world around them. But with a personal essay, you have the opportunity to put them there, right? To sort of create that experience that makes them feel like they're witnessing what you're describing. With reportage and news stories, we have a who, right? But in a personal essay, we get more character development, begin to learn more about who that person is. With reportage, we have a what, whereas in a personal essay, we have more freedom to explore some scenic action in terms of really digging deep into what happened. With reportage, we have more of a when, whereas in personal essay, we have a chronology that helps us to understand a date a little bit more and what happened before and after that. With reportage or a news story, we have the where, right? But in a personal essay, we have more of a setting. We can really begin to visualize where something took place. With reportage, there's the why. Personal essay, we can get at more of the motive. And then we have the how. And then in a personal essay, we can unpack more of how it happened, right? So it's important to be keeping these two columns in mind and recognizing that very often as we do this blending, we're going to be moving back and forth between those two columns. Now, when you're writing reported personal essays, there's some questions that I would encourage you to consider. And one of them is what makes your experience yours, but not yours alone, right? How is your experience different from what's already been written about? But also, how does it speak to some universal themes that others can relate to? How can you make the alien familiar and the familiar surprising? This is a great question to tack up on your little cork board in your office, right? I had a sticky note with this question on it for a while to just help me be thinking about this idea of making the alien familiar so that people could understand my experiences more. And then whose perspective can offer up something that you can't, and whose perspectives can broaden your own. This is important as you think about who to interview for your essays. So, of course, we have primary and secondary sources, primary being people we interview, secondary being links to research and things of that nature. And I would say that typically the essays that I've pitched to news outlets tend to be between 800 and 1,500 words. I prefer more of the 1,500 word length, right? Because I have a tendency to write longer than to write short. Certainly, if you're writing for a magazine, you're going to have a little bit more real estate. But if we look at an 800 to 1,500 word essay, the sweet spot is 2 to 3 primary sources who you're interviewing, and then 2 to 3 secondary sources, meaning kind of links or mentions of research. Okay, so this is sort of what I keep in mind as I'm thinking about how many sources do I want to weave in here. And I always try to remember what I call just the 75-25 rule. And by this, I mean that roughly 75% of the essay should be about you, and the rest should be from other sources that are going to advance your narrative. I think this is important for us to keep in mind, particularly if we are not used to writing personal essays, because, of course, by training, we as journalists are very often taught to leave the I out of our stories. And so it can be a real shift to write a personal essay where we are the focal point. And so keeping that 75-25 rule in mind can help you to remember to keep yourself a priority in the piece, recognizing that this is your story and it is about you, and you have the freedom and permission to actually share your personal perspective. So, like I said, I'm going to share just some examples from my own work just to give you that backstory behind them. This is a piece that ran in the Dallas Morning News in November, and it was essentially a piece that looked at turkey trots, right? Most of us are familiar with those races that happen on Thanksgiving. And I had always been struck by the fact that many of the messages around turkey trots were very much rooted in diet culture. And as someone in recovery from an eating disorder, I found myself really being triggered by those messages. Many of them would say, well, you can earn your Thanksgiving dinner if you just run a 5K, or you can eat all that you want if you run one of these races. And I really wanted to write a piece that would sort of challenge some of this messaging. And so I included my perspective in the majority of the piece, but then I also had 3 primary sources. And I mentioned this in my pitch to the editor. One of these primary sources was a dietitian. So remember, as you think about who you want to interview, you want to ask who can lend a perspective that you can't. I am not a clinician, so I can't speak like a dietitian would, right? Or I can't speak with that expertise. So that voice was important. And this was a dietitian who specialized in eating disorders. And then I also included 2 runners who have lived experience with an eating disorder, and their perspectives complemented my own, but they also opened up different points of relatability because these 2 women were of different ages, they were from different parts of the country, they were at different points in their lives. And so their perspective was therefore different from mine. Now, I just wanted to share this excerpt here. And this essentially is a part in the story where I go from talking about my own personal experience to weaving in a source. So I'm talking about how I stayed silent about these diet culture messages for a long time. And I said, not one to spark confrontation. I stayed silent, right? And just want to do this so I can see it. Okay. Instead of interrogating the inherent harm of such messages, we succumb to them. But this is a missed opportunity to speak up and embrace new language for talking about the food we eat, the reasons why we exercise, and the bodies we live in. We can stay small in the face of diet culture, a system of beliefs that promotes restriction and values thinness, or we can take up space and demand something better. you notice I'm weaving in here a secondary source, right? So people can find out more about diet culture. I spoke about this with registered dietitian Casey Bonanno, who has seen firsthand how detrimental diet talk can be for everyone, including those with eating disorders. There's nothing we need to do besides being alive to deserve and earn food, Bonanno told me. The Thanksgiving meal is only one meal. Yes, sometimes it may be larger than our typical meal or even include foods we don't eat as often, but ultimately is only one meal. It just doesn't have that much power, right? So, one thing to just notice about this is that I'm saying I spoke about this with. That is a really nice transitional line as we think about how we move from the personal to the reported. And so sometimes the blending really comes down to the transition, right? We know as writers that transitions are super important, but never forgetting the I, right? Recognizing that even as we're introducing other perspectives, we want to maintain a presence in those paragraphs. And so I'm starting this paragraph with the I, and then I'm using that technique of saying, Bonanno told me, right? As opposed to Bonanno said, right? It just reminds readers that I'm still there and it makes the language more personal. So some of this really comes down to the diction and word choice that we're using. And you always want to remind your readers of that presence, right? So and so told me is great. Another really nice technique as we think about this blending is cluing readers into why you reached out to your sources and how your conversations with them played out. So, I want to share an excerpt with you from my book. We're going to talk more about the book in a bit, but in this particular excerpt that I'm about to share, it's from the first chapter of the book. And I'm talking about how, in the immediate aftermath of my mother's death, I wrote journal notes to my mom, and I would essentially write to her in my journal. And then I would get out a different color pen and I would write her response to me. And I did this for pages and pages in my journals after she passed away. And I really wanted to write about this, and I wanted to bring in an expert's opinion to kind of look at what was happening, right? What was going on? What was at play here? And so I tried to bring the reader into this and help them understand what the conversation with this expert looked like, right? So this I thought would help with the blending. And this was the excerpt. It says, I was so struck by the journal entries that a few weeks later, I reached out to grief expert Hope Edelman to help me parse what I might have been experiencing. Edelman has written several books on mother loss, including Motherless Daughters, a book I've referred to often throughout the years. Was it worrisome, I asked her, that I tried so hard to interact with my mother and pretend she was alive? I think it becomes detrimental if the child's refusing to acknowledge that the mother isn't going to come back to the physical world and keeps waiting for her and insisting that she's somewhere else. Under those circumstances, she becomes detached from reality, Edelman told me. There's that told me. But the way that you described it, I saw it more as an incredibly resourceful child looking for a way to stay connected to her mom. The journal entries, she said, were likely my way of expressing a continuing bond, right? So here I'm really trying to make the transition from the personal to the reported seamless by talking about how I was really struck by these entries that then prompted me to reach out to an expert. And here's what that conversation with the expert looked like, right? That made for a much more seamless transition than if I were to just drop in a quote from Hope Edelman, right? Which would have been a little bit jarring. And the whole goal with this is to really try and make sure you're not giving readers whiplash as you move from the personal to the reported. Now, personal narratives really should act as the intro and outro for primary and secondary sources. So you never want to let readers lose sight of your story, and you don't want to give them reason to wonder whose story it really is. Sometimes what I find is that when journalists are first beginning to write personal narratives, half the story ends up being about other people. So they kind of bypass that 75-25 rule, but they also just end up kind of putting on their journalistic cap and they're including all these other perspectives, but we lose sight of them as the narrator. And so we want to make sure we don't do that. And one of the ways we can avoid that is by really having the I or the personal narrative be part of that intro and outro. And that's something that I tried to do in one of my more recent personal essays that ran in the Tampa Bay Times a couple months ago. And it was about how, as a mother in recovery from anorexia, I'm trying to help my daughter, who's 9, navigate body image. And so, as I look at this particular piece, one of the things that I did as I was writing it, and even more so in the self editing process, was I looked at my paragraphs and I marked them and I said, okay, this one's personal, this one's reported, right? This one's personal, this one's reported. And that helped me to really be able to see, okay, am I including the personal enough? And am I also weaving in different perspectives? So you can see here that I have kind of a personal paragraph, and then I have followed it up with a quote from an outside expert, right? And then I return to the personal narrative, and then I go to a secondary source. So I'm trying to kind of strike this balance here where I'm really trying to move from the personal to the reported, but always keep that personal top of mind. I'm going to share an example here from the book. And so, one of the ways that you can think about this is to show readers how research helped you arrive at a greater understanding of your own personal experiences. That can be really powerful, and it's a really nice technique when it comes to blending. So, I'm going to share this particular excerpt, which looks at identity. I know it's a little bit long, but I want you to just pay attention as I read this out loud to see how I have helped to show readers how the research enabled me to come to a deeper understanding of my story. So, as anorexia took over, it tattooed a big black X on my being. I let it slowly take hold of me to the point where I stopped saying I have anorexia and started saying I am anorexic. It was no longer a nameless force inside me. It was an undeniable part of who I was, how I saw myself, and how I wanted others to see me. I would later learn that, right? So we've got this transitional line that neurobiological factors were likely at play. It turns out that adolescents' development of self and identity is closely linked to brain development. When adolescents begin to establish their adult identity, connections are formed in the brain. So there we have a nice reported paragraph. To make these connections, the brain relies on white matter, which is made up of myelin, an insulating layer that surrounds the nerve cells. The production of myelin partly relies on a person's dietary fat consumption. Starvation then significantly alters the brain's white matter. Okay, so again, reporting. And notice that I'm talking about neurobiology, which is pretty complicated, right? I had to make sure I really understood it well enough so I could write about it in a way that was accessible. And at the points of greatest complexity in your writing, you want to try to use the shortest words, the shortest phrases, the shortest sentences. So I was very mindful about trying to use short sentences that would be more easily digestible. And also, I wanted to include white space, which really is the space in between paragraphs and in the margins to allow more breathing room for when readers were consuming this more complicated content. And then I move to the personal and I say for adolescents and teenagers with anorexia, white matter alterations can result in a distorted sense of self and altered neurodevelopment. These underlying neurobiological factors, which scientists have only recently begun to understand, could help explain why I was so fixated on my anorexic title all those years ago. Now, when you're reporting, you want to pay attention to those moments where you think, oh my gosh, it makes so much sense now, right? And I had that moment when I learned about this research. And I thought, I want to take readers inside that moment so that they can help me or they can help to understand why that research was so meaningful to me. So that can be another nice blending technique as you think about how to seamlessly transition from the personal to the reported and how to make that feel cohesive from a storytelling standpoint. Transitions, again, are going to be key. And I have found that if you're struggling to make a seamless transition from personal narrative to reportage, try to rely on pronouns. And by that, I mean move from the I to the we. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. This was a personal essay that I wrote for the LA Times about 2 years ago. And it was about how I often will make these origami hearts whenever I have made a really great choice in service of recovery. And I ended up in this particular part of the story transitioning from the personal to the reported by using that pronoun switch from the I to the we. So I said, after getting married and having children, origami felt like one more thing to add to an already exhaustive to-do list. Like so many of our artistic endeavors, mine peaked in childhood and then plateaued. One way to re-engage our creativity is to think of art making as a playground of sorts. When you see art as a space to play, it becomes a space where you can make mistakes with no consequences, said Nadia Paredes, a Los Angeles-based art therapist who has encouraged some of her clients to literally draw outside the lines. By the time you make a mistake in real life, you have a bigger sense of strength and a bigger sense of confidence that you can handle whatever happens, right? So sometimes, again, it's just a matter of tweaking a word so that we can help with that transition. Now, a couple of things I want to say about that particular piece is that I pitched that to the LA Times, and I don't have any connections to LA, but I said that I would do reporting for that essay. And I mentioned that I could interview some LA based art therapists. So that helped, right, in terms of placing that particular essay. I also have found that with personal essays, which are often evergreen, it can help to think about how can you be creative with the timeliness of the piece. And so with that story, I was writing about how I would make these origami hearts. And I thought, well, Valentine's Day is coming up. And so I told the editor that I could have the piece ready for Valentine's Day. And I thought this piece is about these origami hearts. It's ultimately about self-love. And the editor loved that, right? So it ran on Valentine's Day, and that was a time hook. And the other thing to just keep in mind in terms of pro tips is that if you find yourself resisting that 75-25 rule, you could try easing into personal essays with what I call the bookend approach. So I took this approach to a piece that I wrote for the Washington Post 2 years ago. And in this piece, I was looking at healthy eating curricula in schools and talked about how this curricula was really pernicious for me when I was a 12-year-old and how it persists even today. And this piece got more comments than any other piece I've written because it's a very contentious issue, right? Especially with the rates of obesity. Lots of people think we need healthy eating curricula, but I was looking at a different perspective in terms of my own experiences as someone who has had an eating disorder. But with this piece, I started it out with my own personal narrative for the first few paragraphs. And then I did a lot of reporting, and I had that in the whole entire middle part of the piece. And I would still kind of weave myself in a little bit with the so and so told me, or this person did this just as I did when I was younger. So I had these little sort of moments where I'd weave myself into the middle. But then at the end, in the last few paragraphs, I returned to my own narrative in a way that was reflective of the lead, right? So it could kind of be cyclical. And this bookend approach can be effective if you are finding that it's difficult to write an entire piece that is largely focused on you. These slides will be shared after. And so you're welcome to just sort of take a look at some of these stories that I've mentioned if you want to get a better sense of how they're actually structured. Another way of thinking about this, because I'm a very visual person, is to picture your friend visiting you at your new apartment and they want a tour of the place. And so you start by showing them your apartment, which is kind of your personal narrative. And then you walk around and show them the other parts of the building, right? That's the reporting. And then you end up back in your apartment, right? So that's sort of another way of thinking of that bookend approach. So now I want to talk about books. I could talk about essays all day because I love talking about personal essays, but I'm going to shift to books. And I think even if you don't necessarily have a book idea in mind, I think that you'll still find some really interesting tidbits from this portion of the talk. And as Laura mentioned, my book Slip, sorry, shameless plug, but it comes out August 5th. I've been working on different iterations of this book since I was a teenager. So it really does feel so surreal to know that it will soon be out in the world. But it's available for pre order now, and just really excited about the book. And I want to tell you a little bit more about how it came to be. When I was working on the book, I was really drawn to this quote from Suleika Jawad, who's one of my favorite writers. And she wrote a beautiful memoir called Between Two Kingdoms about her experiences with cancer, knowing that she is not in remission and it's still an ongoing kind of illness that she has to contend with. But she said, if you want to write a good book, write what you don't want others to know about you. And if you want to write a great book, write what you don't want to know about yourself. Right. I remember just stopping in my tracks when I first read that. And I thought, yes, I need to be willing to sort of go there with my writing and write about things that I haven't even necessarily admitted to myself yet. And so writing this really was a process of being as truthful as I possibly could about where I'm at in my recovery and where I see myself. And for me, I really wanted to write a book that wasn't like all the other books I'd written or read about eating disorders, which are largely told from the perspective of people who are fully recovered. I really wanted to write a book that looked at what does it mean to live in what I call the middle place between acute sickness and full recovery? What does it mean to be better, but not all better? And how do you live a full life, even knowing that your disorder is a vulnerability? So, those are some of the questions that I really had to unpack. And I had to hold up a mirror to myself to make sure that I was telling my own narrative as truthfully as I possibly could. I could not have written this book, at least not this iteration, 10 years ago, right? Because I would not have been able to be so honest about where I find myself in my recovery. So, again, thinking about when is the right time is really important. So for a long time, my book was the back burner project. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this idea that you have a project you want to work on, but you keep putting it on the back burner and you think I'll get to it at some point. And even though I had worked on different iterations of the book for quite some time, it always felt like it was on the back burner and it was just always an afterthought. And it wasn't actually until I got my MFA in nonfiction writing that I began to make meaningful progress on the book and I was able to start conceiving of it. And so I do not believe that you need to have an MFA in order to write a book. But for me, it was helpful. This was a low residency program at Goucher College. And because of the pandemic, it ended up being no residency. So it was all online. I was still working full time with little kiddos during the pandemic while getting my MFA. So it was not easy, but I got feedback from my professors. I had the time and structure and deadlines to really make meaningful progress on the book. So for me, this was really helpful. It was also fortuitous because there was a part in the program where we got to meet with literary agents. And in order to get a book deal with a big five publisher, you do need a literary agent. I lucked out in finding one, and I didn't have to query dozens or hundreds of agents, which some authors do. What happened for me is that I actually wrote a personal essay during the pandemic. It was published in the New York Times, and it was about how losing my taste and sense of smell during COVID actually was quite triggering for me as someone in recovery from anorexia because it made me not want to eat, right? And that put me in this energy deficit that sort of led to some disordered behaviors. Ultimately, I was able to get out of that once my taste returned, but it was really difficult. It was not something I'd seen other people write about. And very fortuitously, this story was published on March 3rd, 2021 at 11 a.m., which was exactly the same time that this call with agents was beginning. And so I was able to pitch my project to a literary agent and then say, by the way, I had this piece published in the New York Times. And sometimes an essay can lead to a book deal, right? In this case, the essay coupled with my idea for the book led to me getting an agent. So I signed with that agent very quickly after the fact. But don't underestimate the power of personal essays as stepping stones toward a memoir or toward a book, right? Similarly, if you are writing kind of more news related stories or feature stories, oftentimes those can be grounds for really rich narrative nonfiction, not necessarily a memoir, right? So just be keeping that in mind. And when I initially pitched this book and talked about it with my agent, I really thought this is going to be a straightforward memoir. It's going to be about my own story. I'm going to do reporting in the sense that I'm going to look at my old journal entries, my old therapy workbooks, old photos, old medical records, which I had obtained. And that for me was how I envisioned reporting. But what I found was that that wasn't quite enough. And I think that this is really important because this is not something that MFA programs teach. It's not something that we as journalists necessarily know about. But I want to share this timeline with you because it is very difficult to get a book published. It's really difficult to get a memoir published. And I wish that that were not the case. I remember years ago, had reached out to an agent who told me that there was no way I could get a book deal for a memoir because I didn't have enough social media followers. She said, you need tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of followers and a much bigger platform than you do. And I remember feeling so crestfallen by that because it made me think that essentially the only way that a memoir has value or worth in the eyes of a publisher is if that person is famous or has a huge platform. I think that the publishing industry has evolved since then. And certainly people who are famous are more likely to have their memoirs on the New York Times bestseller list. But it's not to say you can't get a memoir published, but there's some things you have to do, right? So this is just a timeline. All said and done, I got over 35 rejections, which I think is important to just say, right? Because we don't talk enough about rejections when it comes to publishing. But I want to just focus on this part of the timeline here, November 2021. By that point, my agent had sent out my proposal to several different editors. I got 17 rejections. And I kept thinking, oh, why? Right? There was no sort of continuity in the feedback I was getting from editors. But around this same time, which was really interesting, there was this new term emerging. And this term is Memoir Plus. Some of you may have heard of it, but it's gained traction in the past few years. And it's this idea that in order to write a successful memoir as someone who's not famous or doesn't have a huge platform, you need to have memoir plus something else. And this is where journalists can really shine, right? Because that plus can be reporting. And that's what it was for me, right? It can be reporting, research, science. I ended up getting a grant from the Sloan Foundation to kind of do more science reporting for the book. So that was a plus. It could be history, social commentary, criticism, could even be something experiential like a road trip. The idea is that you're adding in something beyond your own narrative, beyond your own story, so that you can open up more points of relatability and also educate readers in a different way. And so I ended up reworking my whole proposal and really decided to make this a book that didn't just look at my own lived experience with anorexia, but that also included perspectives from lots of other people. And ultimately, that's what helped me get the book deal, right? So we as journalists are in a really good position to think about how do we blend that personal narrative and that reporting to help us to write a memoir that is likely to get attention from publishers and that will ultimately be more relatable for readers. These are some other books that I think do a really good job in this memoir plus genre. So if you're looking for examples of this, I would check out these 4 books in particular. Again, we'll share this recording and these slides so you'll have access to these after the fact. But for my book slip, I ended up surveying 718 people with lived experience with an eating disorder from 44 states and 37 countries. Now, I did this with a Google form. I had some doctors look at the questions that I was asking, but essentially I sent this out and just proactively shared it on Facebook groups. I shared it with eating disorder treatment centers. I sent out lots of individual emails and was blown away by the fact that over 700 people responded. And this was a gold mine when it came to finding people to interview for the book. I also interviewed 175 clinicians, researchers, and people with lived experience from around the world. So, as you can see, this book really evolved from being a straightforward memoir to a memoir that really blended personal narrative with a lot of reporting. And I also consulted lots of source materials. So this is just some of the research I looked at old 17 magazines that I consumed when I was sick, looked at lots of different books, right? So I was sort of reading, reporting, doing a whole lot to make this book as good as it could be. And in the end, in the end notes, I had about 10,000 words of end notes, just sort of showing all of the different studies that I consulted as I was working on this book. And in many cases, I ended up interviewing the researchers behind these studies because I really wanted to make sure I was understanding the content in a way that would enable me to really write about it accessibly and in a way that was comprehensible, especially when writing about genetics, for instance, or the neurobiology of eating disorders. So, this is just a sampling of some of the researchers who I interviewed. Now, one thing that I found was really helpful as I thought about this blending of personal narrative and reporting was to focus on the ladder of abstraction. Now, some of you may have heard of this term. It comes from S.I. Hawakawa, who wrote about this in one of his books. He was a politician and an academic and a writer. And essentially, the ladder of abstraction is a literary device to help you to think about including abstract concepts and concrete details in your writing. And so, one of my longtime mentors from the Poynter Institute, Roy Peter Clark, once taught me that this question, can you give me an example, will drive sources down the ladder, but what does it mean will carry them aloft? And I think whenever we are writing personal narratives that bring in reporting, we want to make sure that we are thinking about these two questions, right? Can you give me an example if you're talking to a researcher, or if you're writing about your own story? Can I give readers an example, right? And then overall, what does it mean, right? So let's look at an example of this. So one thing that can be really helpful with this ladder is that it does help you to think about how do you move from the personal narrative to the reporting to the blending of the personal narrative and reportage as you move farther down toward the concrete, right? You think about a ladder literally being on the concrete. At the bottom of the ladder is where you have those concrete details. So, this one example comes from the last chapter of my book, which looks at the very strong genetic component of eating disorders. And in this chapter, I'm exploring what it means to be a mother in recovery, knowing that eating disorders can be genetic. And so at the top of the ladder, I was thinking about this very big abstract concept of inheritance, right? Usually we have kind of abstract terms or universal themes at the top of that ladder. And those are important to have in our writing, right? But then I thought, okay, I need to be able to unpack what inheritance actually means. And so I began to look at genetic research, and that was reporting that I did. I was reading the research, I was interviewing geneticists. And as I was talking with geneticists, there were many times where I thought, oh my gosh, I really don't understand this, right? Or I think I understand this, but I'm not quite sure. And so I would often ask them, can you give me an example? And one of the researchers I was interviewing gave me this very concrete example and metaphor of a deck of cards. And for me, that deck of cards was what I needed to be able to blend the personal and the reported. And so Cynthia Bulick was the geneticist I was interviewing, and she was saying that there are protective environmental factors that allowed you, meaning me, to be here today, that got you to the point where you're not a statistic of someone who didn't survive anorexia. This is therapy, this is family, this is friends, Bulick said, making me think about how lucky I've been to have support. And then there are the protective genetic factors. We know a lot about these, but they could be genes that turn off or quiet, or we know a lot less about these, but they could be genes that turn off or quiet or buffer the genetic risk factor. So for me, I thought, okay, this is fascinating. And I asked her, I was thinking about this ladder because I wanted her move down the ladder of abstraction. And I said, can you give me an example of what you mean by this? And she said, sure. She said, let's think of a deck of cards, right? And I thought, oh, great. I love when I get researchers who can give me a metaphor or an example. But she said the four factors are like the four suits in a deck of cards: spades and clubs for risk and protective factors, and diamonds and hearts for risk and protective environmental factors. We're each dealt a hand, one we carry throughout our lives. We don't have any say over how many spades or clubs we hold, but our numbers of diamonds and hearts may change over time, depending on how we grow up, how we care for ourselves, and how we respond to the events that shape our lives. In other words, eating disorders are the result of what happens not just within us, but also around us. And so that last paragraph is mine, right? But from there on, I kind of use this deck of cards to help to illustrate inheritance, right? And that deck of cards enabled me to sort of more easily oscillate between the personal and the reported. So that ladder of abstraction technique can be really helpful as we think about blending. Now, of course, we can't talk about blending without talking about structure. And for me, one of the biggest questions that I grappled with is how do you write a book that is equal parts personal narrative and reporting? There are a lot of books that take a braided approach, and maybe they're primarily personal, but they weave in a little bit of reporting, or maybe they're primarily reported and they have a little bit of the personal, but mine was really equal parts both. And my original plan was to have alternating chapters where I'd have one chapter that was personal and memoiristic, and then another chapter that was really reported and researched. But in writing a few chapters like that, my editor and I looked at them and we felt like they weren't quite working well. It felt like it was too jarring to go from one to the next. And so my editor suggested that I take a split chapter approach. Now, I had never heard of this before, so I was a little daunted by it. And I still don't know of any books that do it. So I'm hoping that maybe this will give writers some ideas about how they may approach their own work. But essentially, with each chapter, there is a central theme. And the first half of each chapter is very personal, it's deeply narratively driven. And then in the second half of each chapter is where I'm weaving in all of the interviews I did, all of the research that I consulted. And both halves are unified by a central theme. So, for instance, in chapter 4 of the book, which looks at treatment, the first half of the chapter is looking at my first hospitalization for anorexia when I was 13. And I'm really diving deep into that moment in time. And then in the second half, which is marked by this visual infinity symbol, I am looking at the evolution of care and treatment since that time in the late 90s when I was first treated. And I'm bringing in perspectives from people who were more recently treated, bringing in perspectives from treatment providers, things of that nature. And this ended up being a really powerful way of thinking about how can I bring in the personal and the reported together in a way that enables me to have breathing room for both, but that also helps me to seamlessly bring them together in the same chapter. So I really loved this approach and it felt very experimental. So I kind of had to carve out my own pathway for figuring out how to do this. But I think it can be really beneficial for writers because for me, it gave me greater clarity on the overarching theme of each chapter. And it gave me breathing room for the personal narrative and the reporting and enabled me to really dive deep into both. It also helped me to kind of have my present day self be in conversation with my younger self because my younger self was in those earlier kind of personal narrative parts. And in the second part of each chapter, I was writing from more of my present day self. So I love this idea of the different selves being in conversation with each other. So, as we wrap up, I wanted to just show you a couple of images. I just geek out on structure. And for me, there were so many moving pieces for each chapter that I was writing. And so, what I would do is I would take all of my notes from both the personal and the reported parts. And I would write out all of the kind of main details and anecdotes that I wanted to include on post it notes. Sometimes I'd use origami paper too. But then I would kind of just lay them out on a table. And this is me here at the kitchen table with my two kiddos. But I'd lay them out and I would think of them as moving pieces. And then I would get just a whiteboard and I would kind of put these little post it notes on the whiteboard and I would move them around as I saw fit until I found a structure that I thought worked well. And here you can see in the picture, the pink represents the personal parts, the blue represents the reported parts. And then I would keep this whiteboard in front of me. This was just sort of a trifold that I had in my office. And I would use it and look at it as I was writing each chapter, right? So I did one of these for every chapter I wrote, and it really acted as a roadmap for me. I never structured things really or outlined things before I wrote the book. But for me, it was just critical to do outlining as I wrote the book, just because of the sheer volume of content I was working with. So this structure really helped. And I ended up writing about this for Harvard University's Nieman Storyboard, just to sort of explain a little bit more about my process for kind of structuring a book that is equal parts personal narrative and reporting. And I do this with essays too, right? So just thinking about coming back to the essay for this essay that I wrote for the Tampa Bay Times recently, I did the same thing where I had these little pieces of origami paper and I was mapping out where my own narrative would be and what I wanted to include, and then how I was going to bring in those other sources. And so visually, this helped me to kind of make sure I was maintaining that 75-25 approach that I mentioned. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions. I feel like I could talk about this all day, but please do keep in touch. Like I said, in a minute, we'll segue to questions. But if you have other questions that you think of after the fact, please feel free to email me. I'm also on Instagram quite often and have a website and then that weekly newsletter where I share a lot of writing tips. Lastly, I do want to just say too that I'm going to be on book tour next month and in September. So if any of my stops coincide with a city that you're in, I would love for you to join me on the tour. I'm excited to be in community and conversation with folks about the book. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I know we've got some questions in the chat, which I haven't yet looked at, but Laura, how do you want to
Yeah.
approach the Q&A?
Oh, Mallory, thank you so much. This was excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm seeing one question that people would like to have answered in the chat, and it came from Gail, and others are responding to it. Did you have a complete manuscript when you submitted proposals?
So I did not. So with fiction, you typically do have to have a completed manuscript that your agent will send to publishers. But with nonfiction, you don't need to have one. And so with my proposal, it ended up being about 85 pages long, which I never knew book proposals were that long, but it was about 85 pages. It included sample chapters from the book. So I had 3 sample chapters. But the understanding, particularly with nonfiction and memoir, is that you are going to need that advance to do more reporting, to take reporting trips, and that you're going to need more time to flesh out the book. And so I'm really glad that I didn't end up having the full manuscript done, because it was my editor at Simon and Schuster who really sort of helped me to think through the structure, and that then required me to do more reporting than I had initially planned.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And Greg asks this question: Did you switch agents when you shifted your approach to the book, or stick with the same agent?
I stuck with the same agent. I really am grateful to have an amazing agent who stuck with me throughout the process, even after that 35th rejection. I've heard horror stories of people being dropped by their agents, but mine stuck with me. And I think that in some ways, I went out on submission at the wrong time, in the sense that we didn't really know much about Memoir Plus. But then after that first round of rejections, and then as Memoir Plus started to become more prevalent, that was when I really worked with my agent to say, okay, I don't want to give up on this book. And I want to figure out, how do I really change this so that it still aligns with my vision, but also is going to be kind of appealing to a commercial publisher. Something just to piggyback off that as well is that I think it is really important, when you're kind of trying to approach publishers, to make sure that you do have a clear sense of your vision for the book. Because at one point I was going to get a book deal from a publisher, but they only wanted to give me a book deal if I agreed to write the book with a medical provider. And I just wasn't willing to do that. I did not want the book to be clinical. I wanted to maintain sole authorship. And so for me, that was just not something I was willing to do. I was, though, willing to do more reporting, right? I was willing to do that and pivot. But I needed to sort of stay true to my overall vision for the book and not sacrifice that just for the sake of getting a book deal.
David Oliver has a question also tied to the issue of getting an agent. Any tips for finding an agent after a series of many rejections?
So rejections are going to be inevitable most of the time when we think about finding an agent or getting a publisher. I would say that if you are finding that you're getting one rejection after another, it might be that you're just not finding the right agents, right? So that could be one possibility. I always like to look at the acknowledgement sections of books and see who the author has thanked, because typically they're thanking agents. And I try to find books that are similar to the ones that I want to write. And then I look and see, okay, who is their agent? That's something I used to do. It could also be that maybe there's something that's just not quite hitting the mark with your manuscript or with your proposal. And so you may end up wanting to seek outside feedback from a coach or an editor or someone who can look at it and say, okay, what is it about this that just isn't quite catching agents' attention? Is it perhaps just the structural approach that I'm taking with it? Is it maybe the way that I am labeling it? So one thing I found was that it was not as good for me to call my book a memoir, right? Because there were a lot of publishers who just didn't really want literary memoir. They weren't acquiring it. And I initially pitched my book as a literary memoir. But after I did more reporting, I decided that I didn't want to use that terminology, memoir, at least when pitching editors. So I began to call it more of a narrative nonfiction book, which was more appealing to publishers. So sometimes it's a matter of also understanding that lingo. Now that I have the book deal and the book's going to be out soon, I often call it a memoir because I think of it as such. But sometimes you have to be a little bit strategic with the language that you're using when pitching agents and publishers.
Thank you for that. That's excellent. And we have a couple of really good questions here from Jasmine Osby. It says, one of them is there such a thing as oversharing when writing a personal narrative?
Mm-hmm. So I think that that question is a really important one, and it's really going to be dependent upon the person and what they feel comfortable with. I think that where we get into oversharing territory is when we begin to share the narratives of other people and we don't necessarily have their consent, right? Or it's not necessarily our story to tell. I found myself sometimes doing that where I wanted to write about experiences that my mother had, but there was no way that I could really write about them as meaningfully as I wanted to because I couldn't interview my mother, right? She has passed away, and there's no way I could have gotten at the full story. And there were moments where I thought, that's really one, not all that germane to the story I'm trying to tell. And it's also not my story to tell, right? And so I think that sometimes that's when the oversharing can become problematic. I also think too, with oversharing, you want to ask yourself, are you going to be okay with this being in a book, in an essay, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Are you going to be okay with your kids or your grandkids seeing this someday? Those were questions I often asked. And I have found that I am okay with sharing a lot, right? There's a lot of stuff that years ago I wouldn't have, but over time, as I've gotten more mature and more confident, I've just realized that's part of my story and I'm willing to tell it. But those decisions came from many years of experimenting with personal essays and journal writing. And I think journal writing can be a really great place to suss out what you feel comfortable sharing and what just needs to remain in the pages of those journals.
Great. Okay, and here's another good question from Jasmine. Do you think residency programs and writing fellowships are beneficial during the process?
So I think they can be. I will say I applied for some residency programs and writing fellowships and didn't get any of them. So I don't think that they are critical by any means, although I know people who swear by them and they come away feeling like they just ended up getting so much work done. I think part of that has to do with really just changing our environment, right? Really being someplace away from the day to day, away from our routine, because sometimes literally putting ourselves in a different environment can help us to see things differently. It can open our eyes to something different. It can help us to avoid the distractions of the day to day. And so sometimes I think it's literally that that can be helpful, as well as being in community with people. For me, it was helpful to find local writing groups here in Austin. I went to a lot of retreats put on by a woman named Zibby Owens, who is a kind of book publisher and influencer, and met a lot of really great writers through that. And so I really tried to build up community. And I also tried to apply for grants, which was something I did have luck with. I wasn't having luck with the residency programs, but I applied to grants and applied for grants anywhere from $2,000 to $50,000. And I didn't get any of the smaller ones, but I got the biggest one that I applied for. So I mentioned that just because sometimes you need to just kind of go and aim high, because as long as you can justify why you need those funds, you may very well end up getting them, right? So never hurts to try.
You know, I have one question for you, Mallory. This is something we've chatted about before, but maybe could you tell us, how did you schedule time? You have such a busy life, full-time job, two kids. How did you schedule time to work on the book?
So I will admit that I did not get much sleep while writing the book, and I still don't get much sleep, but I really had to find just a routine. And so for me, that meant getting up super early in the morning. As I mentioned, I was really beginning to work on this book during the pandemic, and there was a long stretch where I had my two kids at home with me. I was teaching part time, I was working full time. It was just insanity, but I would get up at 4 a.m. to write. And I found that that worked for me. For a while prior to that, I was writing at night because I've always been more of a natural night owl. But I found that writing about really heavy topics right before bed was not good because it kept me up at night. And then also, I never had a hard stop. I'd just keep writing until 1 or 2 in the morning. And then my kids would be up by 5:36 the next day. So I decided I'm going to write in the morning. I'll have a hard stop because I know I need to stop by 5:45 to get myself and my kids ready for the day. And it also was quiet, right? I wasn't getting bombarded by emails or Slack messages. And that just became part of the routine. I put it on the calendar, I set the alarm. That's how I got the writing done. And then I would sprinkle in interviews during the lunch hour or other times during the day. But I think finding that routine and finding pockets of time to write can be really helpful. And know that you're not always going to get 2 hours a day to write, right? I always told myself, as long as I touch my project every day, that's what counts. And some days I just couldn't really gain momentum in the morning writing time. And I'd only end up with, 100 words, but at least I had touched it that day. And for me, that's what counted.
Okay, well, here we are. We're at the end of the hour. Wasn't this a great presentation, everybody? Oh, thank you so much, Mallory. Thank you so much. And I put the link to Mallory's book in the chat. Everyone can pre-order it now, and yeah, I cannot wait to get my copy. Cannot wait. I'm so excited for you, Mallory, and can't thank you enough for doing this. And we'll send the recording out within the next day or two, so
That sounds wonderful.
people can catch it.
Thank you. And I put my email address in the chat there. So feel free to reach out if I didn't get to answer your questions during the webinar. And thanks for being such a great audience, and good luck with all your projects.
Thank you so much.